the ethics of social action. And I'm going to begin with one of my favorite stories about social action. Lauren Isley, a scientist, tells a story in one of his books about the star thrower. He tells of going out on a beach late at night, a beach on which starfish have washed ashore. All along the beach, people are taking starfish and dropping them into pots of boiling water to boil away the flesh, leaving the hard starfish body for sale to tourists and others. All along this beach, the man passes campfires with these kettles of death. And at the end of the beach, he sees another man picking up starfish, tossing them out to sea, one by one. What are you doing? I am throwing them back out where they might survive. But why? Most will be caught in the undertow, will come back in and die anyway. Why bother? He asked that as the man threw out another starfish. Because, came the reply, this one might survive. And he tossed the starfish as far as he could back out to sea. Whenever I think of the story of the star thrower, I also think of Felix Adler's poetic and passionate phrase, summarizing for him one of the three greatest pains for modern humanity. He said, "We stand, as it were, on the shore and see multitudes of our fellow beings struggling in the water, stretching forth their arms, sinking, drowning, and we are powerless to assist them." Adler conceived of the ethical society as a place where people could meet to seek the highest, thereby creating a holy ground. And part of that seeking the highest was to discover together how we might answer that great yearning and pain in us to deal with the multitudes of our fellow beings who are struggling in the water. Well, Adler's answer was simple, yet it is not simple to put into practice. It is because of our powerlessness to save all of humanity that we must do what we can where we are with what we have. His answer is similar to Marian Wright Edelman's much more recent statement that if you don't like the way the world is, you change it. You have an obligation to change it. You just do it one step at a time. As an ethical leader, I'm often considered a spokesperson for the ethical movement, and I'm often asked a question by people who see our literature and read our statements of purpose. Why aren't ethical societies doing today the kind of ethical action that they did historically? And with some embarrassment, I don't have any easy answers to it. The simple answer, what is sometimes called the elevator answer, because it's short enough to give when you're given that question in an elevator and only have a short time to answer before your questioner steps out on their floor. Well, the simple answer is this. First of all, we are doing quite a bit in the ethical movement today. And second, we didn't do quite as much back then as we take credit for, or at least it isn't quite so clear that we have ever fulfilled our ideals in ethical action. And third, we are not so different in this from the broader culture that we live in. Ethical culture, one might say, is a religion of doing good. Our purpose includes a commitment to the knowledge, love, and practice of right living in all the relations of life. We are not together about salvation in an afterlife. Such beliefs are for individual decision. We are about making the world and our lives better here and now during this lifetime. Thus, social action, as it's been defined in our history, is an important pillar of any ethical society. How we act in our small and our larger circles of influence is what our religion is about. It is our center, our focus, and our inner core. Well, what is social action? I would define it simply as action taken to improve social conditions in the face of perceived or real injustice. I think too of Ralph Waldo Emerson, who in the 19th century, in one of his famous essays, proposed the idea that every generation has its establishment and its movement. And yes, he used those terms. The movement working for change, the establishment trying to keep the system as it has been. As I've thought about this over the years, I've realized that there are actually 3 R's in the movement. Emerson mostly was talking about reformers, although certainly he knew from activity in Europe about the second R's, which were revolutionaries who try to overturn the whole system, not repair it. And I have more recently added reactionaries, people who are not simply trying to save the system as it is, but to take it back to some imagined past. For reactionaries, the injustice that they are reacting to is the threat to their power and privilege. So, for instance, we have white nationalists who are getting more and more active and visible in our country. For them, what they see as injustice is that white people are losing their privileged place. It is among the reactionaries that a term social justice warrior becomes a pejorative term. So for us, for our context of social action, I would allege that the context is very different than it is for many others who work for reform or revolution, and certainly as reactionaries. And that is, our context for social action is our affirmation of the worth of every individual and the importance of interconnections. Action to bring out the worth in another person is how we bring out our own best. So social justice work is also personal transformation. The other part of this context is that we affirm that social justice work, social action, can only be done with others. I've spoken before about Felix Adler's ideas, and some of which are definitely dated and some of which are very appropriate today. One of the things that I think we continue from the time of Adler is to set a priority in our social action. And that is part of our ethical culture context for social action too. And what is that priority? The priority in social action work is to work with those who are marginalized, oppressed, underserved by society. The highest priority to those people whose worth is least currently recognized or actualized. Well, it's not an ethical culture project, but I think today, one of the best models of what I think ethical culture social action teaches is the Poor People's Campaign. That campaign brings together causes of economic justice, equality, including racial, gender, and sexuality equality, addressing climate change, addressing militarism, and it addresses those in coalition, trying to bring together the people who are active on the individual issues and bring them together. So for instance, in June in Washington, D.C., the Poor People's Campaign is trying to bring together people who are poor or low income and their allies. This is social action by those most affected by the injustice, along with those who are less affected by the social inequities personally, but who are willing to ally for the sake of social justice. Now, I will admit, and it's important when we talk about the ethics of social action, it is most difficult to be ethical when the world around us is unethical, That's true for both personal and for social ethics. So we look at Ukraine, which is on many of our minds. When buildings are being bombed and the weakest in society are being targeted, children and women, and those who are in hospitals, that's an extreme form of militarism. But let's acknowledge too that militarism exists on a continuum. I think here of the MOVE bombing in Philadelphia, which our own government in Pennsylvania bombed an entire city street while people were in some of those houses. Many of the armed conflicts today are caused or exacerbated by climate change. As the planet heats up, so will the ways in which people act to try to solve their real or perceived problems. It is most difficult to be ethical in how we react when we are in a situation which is most highly unethical. So one of the other observations I've made, and this comes from observing first Unitarian Universalists and then for the past 30 years, ethical culturists. We tend, I think, to differ much more on tactics and priorities than on how we stand on issues. I see a lot of the arguments within ethical societies are not about whether the issue is right or wrong, but about how do we approach it. And so one of the things I've looked at over the years in looking at the ethics of social action is that there are, I believe, 6 different kinds of ethical action based on tactics. And again, we often get into ethical arguments about which one is more ethical than the other. The first one I would call direct service. That is action which heals and helps, usually individuals who are suffering under the current oppression or inequality. So for instance, under direct service would be social action projects like a homeless shelter or a food pantry or a project to resettle a refugee. Often though, when people are very active over a period of time on social action projects relating to service, they begin to have some questions. Why are there so many homeless people? Why are there so many hungry people? Why are there so many refugees? Is it enough in social action to simply help those who are hurting and to heal individuals when there are more people who are homeless and hungry or refugees being created? And so a second kind of social action I call education. That is social action that is designed to inform self and others. Sometimes people don't even consider this to be a kind of social action, but it is an important step in the process of changing the world so that it is more equal, more peaceful, more just. And education includes careful research to figure out what's actually going on and what would help. Education includes one-on-one conversations with people with whom we disagree. I would even say that education includes whistleblowing, where we educate people on what is actually going on in a situation. The third kind of ethical action I call witness, which is when we take a stand. Mass marches and demonstrations fall into this category. It is something which experts on dealing with dictatorships say is that when a society can turn out about 5% of its population in mass demonstrations, the fact that that many people have been willing to take a stand can break that dictatorship and usually does. It doesn't directly make the change, but it says there are more of us than there are of them. So another kind of witness is the signs in our building. We have a peace pole, a Progress Pride flag, and a Black Lives Matter banner. They are a witness to what we stand for in the world. Our Washington and St. Louis ethical societies, for about a year after the big Black Lives Matter demonstrations 2 summers ago, each of them had a weekly gathering in front of their building where members stood with signs on the streets that their buildings are on, which have major traffic. So that was another way of witnessing. One I remember from my youth, and some of you are old enough to remember during the Vietnam War protests, the Vietnamese Buddhist monks who lit themselves on fire as a way of calling attention and taking a stand. In Ukraine, in the current situation, I think of the incredible marches in Russia, even knowing that thousands of the tens of thousands who were marching would be imprisoned. It also includes the lighting up of buildings with blue and yellow around the world to say, where do we stand? I'm actually wearing wearing glasses today that have a sunflower on them. That's a small way of witnessing to the people who are suffering in Ukraine. So witness is the third kind. The fourth kind is lobbying, a way to influence decision makers. I think here of Indivisible, which has primarily focused on this kind of social change. And that's where you write, call, and visit those who are decision makers who can actually make the change. I would put signing petitions somewhere between some combination of witness and lobbying, because it shows how many people take that stand. What we do know from lots and lots of research is that decision makers are less swayed by petitions than they are by in-person visits, which have been difficult for the last 2 years, or calls or individualized letters. In terms of lobbying, I would say in our current situation in Ukraine, sanctions we can see as a kind of lobbying. That is, they are a way to try to influence decision makers in Russia. The sanctions themselves don't directly stop the killing, although they may wreck Russia's economy enough that it makes it harder for them to stop the killing, to do the killing. But sanctions primarily try to create enough pain to influence the decision makers to change their minds. Then there is, for the fifth kind of social action, direct action. This is where you directly change the system. You make the system change. I think here, whether you agree with it or not, many times that protesters have released caged research animals to protest their use in research, stopping nuclear ships from entering a harbor. But it can also be small ways of direct action. I think here of Plant Native Northwest Bronx, our new organization, which is planning to change the actual ecosystem here in the Bronx. Direct action can be refusal to buy products that are made unethically or from companies that behave unethically. We actually interrupt their success, so we make change. One of the classic cases of this was very early 20th century. happened. I know the situation in Chicago more than other cities, but in Chicago, the settlement house activists at Hull House came to believe that one of the ways that poor children were oppressed was they had no place to play. They lived in tenement houses, the streets were busy, there were no yards. And so Hull House workers began to find vacant lots and create playgrounds. Another way, and my ex-husband did this when he was in the Peace Corps, was actually to clean up a dangerous spare lot. And frankly, when Russia invades your country and starts killing civilians, fighting to expel them is a kind of direct action. It is not a nonviolent action, but it is a kind of social action. And finally, the sixth kind of social action, and this is a kind which ethical culture through its history has often participated in, is to institutionalize the change and response. It's good to make our statements known and to try to make a change immediately, but it really helps to try to make that change in a way that keeps it going beyond our activist time. So a great example here, and I'll go back to Hull House and its campaign for playgrounds. What Hull House did was first it used vacant lots and got some rich people to buy some of those vacant lots and created playgrounds. Then it used lobbying to try to get the city to establish playgrounds permanently. And so the ultimate effect here of the social action was to institutionalize playgrounds in Chicago. And in the city of Chicago, it's rare that a child has to walk more than 2 blocks to get to at least a small playground. And that really began with Hull House's social action to create them in poor neighborhoods. The Hull House model, which Felix Adler and many of our first generation of ethical culturists were part of, the settlement house model, was to have private organizations. And this ties together some of the different kinds of social action. To begin by experimenting with social services, to give direct help, to heal and help. To move to education about the causes of the problems, to move to witness, and then begin to make direct changes, and then often through lobbying to institutionalize the change. I think we often fight about which one of these is more important. And the reality is that they all work together. I actually have to add another kind of social action, which I don't find an effective kind, which is toleration, of accepting what is going on. You might call it avoidance. Yes, there's injustice, but what am I supposed to do about it? There's just too much to do, so I won't do anything. It assumes that we are powerless. Sometimes we question the importance of the social change. Another common way to do it among those who are the most radical and who want systemic change is to put off a lot of social change, except the one that they're focused on. The phrase, when the revolution comes, when we overturn capitalism, then we can start working on racial equality or gender equality. That I put as a kind of toleration and indifference. We wait until the whole system is upended, and we're not going to act on the specific inequalities until we have that done. So going back to Felix Adler, he said that it was because we are powerless to do it all, that we have to become our full human selves, move away from indifference, move away from a sense of powerlessness, and do whatever is in our power, however small, to create more justice. Elie Wiesel, whose experience began and is rooted in his experience in the concentration camps of the mid-20th century, wrote, "For one who is indifferent, life itself is a prison. Any sense of community is external or even worse, non-existent. Thus, indifference means solitude. Those who are indifferent do not see others. They feel nothing for others and are unconcerned with what might happen to them. They are surrounded by a great emptiness, filled by it, in fact. They are devoid of all hope as well as imagination. In other words, devoid of any future." There is much in our society which tries to teach us to be indifferent, to tolerate, to think we are powerless. The ethical culture answer, I believe, to the ethics of social action is to find what you can do and do that. Now, notice that some of the things I haven't included here. One is being outraged or critiquing society. Critique sometimes can be part of education if it is directed towards movement. It also does not include simply talking to your friends about how outraged you are or what's wrong with society. If our outrage and critique do not motivate action, they are just a kind of indifference. So in choosing those tactics, and I would say that all 6 of those tactics are crucial and often evolve one to the other. One of the things that we have to choose is on the basis of is urgency. So for instance, lobbying in this country takes a long time. Direct action and mass movements and witness can all often be done quickly. Grace Lee Boggs, the organizer of poor women around the world primarily, said this, and it was reflected in the song that we heard last week. She always asked this question of organizers: what time is it on the clock of the world? In other words, how urgent is this need? How urgent is it that we do something about climate change? How urgent is it that we act on whatever it is that is an issue of importance to you? And the other dimension is how important is it? So urgency and importance will tell us what we act on. When we look at importance, I also think it's useful to remember, to whom are we thinking it is important? If we are people with some level of privilege, we might question whether we are the ones who get to judge the importance, or whether it is those with less power and privilege who get to decide what is most important. I do see these different tactics as often a progression. There is the old story, supposedly a Buddhist story, of the 2 monks who go walking and they come to a river and they see babies floating down the river. And so one monk jumps in to save them and another keeps walking. He is going upriver to try to stop whoever is throwing babies into the river. And in this story, each of those 2 monks judges the other as wrong. Well, I would have to say, if there are babies being thrown in the river and there are 2 of you, I think it's a great idea for one to rescue the babies that are coming down the river and one to go stop what is happening. To me, that is an illustration of why we need to have a variety of tactics to have ethical social action. Peace is kind of like that. You know, in Ukraine, how do we work to rescue the metaphorical babies? Do we stop those who are throwing them into the river? Do we prevent those who would throw babies into a river from ever gaining power, which is a whole nother level, which in the resolution at the AEU last year, we reaffirmed our commitment to creating long-term a culture of peace. Just a couple of other questions in ethical action and its ethics. I think one of the other ones is, how do we treat each other as we work for social justice? I've been in a lot of social justice organizations, and often within the movement, people do not live up to their own beliefs. The classic case of this is the abolitionist movement, which ended up leading to the first wave of women's rights activities, because many women in the abolitionist movement were not respected as individuals, even while the movement was preaching respect for all individuals. That pattern was repeated again in the 1960s in the civil rights and anti-war movements, when the women were often expected to clean up, make cookies and coffee, and that led to the so-called second wave of feminism. So I just want to conclude that because we are powerless to solve all injustice, and I want to acknowledge that we will never solve all injustice. Because we are powerless to solve it all, we are, I believe, responsible to do what we have with the power to do. In the words of the French writer Molière, it is not only for what we do that we are held responsible, but also for what we do not do. Or Marian Wright Edelman, if you don't like the way the world is, you change it. You have an obligation to change it. You just do it, one step at a time. We'll now say goodbye to those of you watching later on video, and invite those who are watching later to attend a live talk with our community on some Sunday morning.